End-of-year polls to mark the third anniversary of Britain's exit from the EU showed an overwhelming majority of voters agree it's not a good idea. And in respect of trade, inflation, the NHS, economic growth, immigration, tax, and the many other misleading claims peddled by both the Leave campaign of 2016, it has undoubtedly been a failure. But David Cameron had no idea his opponents would use those arguments when announcing the idea of holding a referendum in January 2013. He said it would settle this European question in British politics, and against that criteria, I would suggest Brexit has been a remarkable success. Pro-EU sentiment is now higher both in the UK and continental Europe than it has been for years, and crucially much higher than it would have been without Brexit. Having experienced life outside the EU, a clear majority in the UK now want a closer relationship and believe, in hindsight, that Brexit was a mistake. And last month, the YouGov poll showed that 57% of voters would support rejoining the single market, even if this meant restoring free movement of people, with just 22% opposed. In 3 short years, Brexit has achieved what the UK's pro-EU contingent have failed to do in 30 or more. And the sad truth is that without Brexit, Britain would never be weaned off the exceptionalism that they have been addicted to for decades. Nothing less than going cold turkey was going to do the trick here. After 2010, David Cameron could have resisted his ultras, but was that ever a real option? Yeah, he probably didn't have much chance. But it's easy to forget now, but all the main UK parties had toyed at various times in the previous decade with the idea of holding a referendum on Britain's position in Europe, recognizing the rise of Farage's UKIP and the fact they were not a wholly committed member of the European club. In the 2015 general election, UKIP took over 12% of the vote and gained 1 seat. And Cameron's slim 12-seat majority meant he would always have been vulnerable to a challenge. Sooner or later, he would have been replaced by someone further to the right. And just imagine a referendum led by a hard Eurosceptic Prime Minister and Chancellor with all the power and influence of the Treasury behind them. Refusing to hold a referendum would also have been a gift to UKIP, consolidating and strengthening an avowedly Eurosceptic party at the center of British politics. Assisted by the right-wing press, they would quickly have had a body of vocal MPs in the Commons, in addition to MEPs in Strasbourg. The mythical stories that did so much to color public opinion about the EU in the years running up to the referendum would have become turbocharged. Every internal UK problem would have continued to be blamed on balmy Eurocrats. For Brexiteers, the EU Commission's handling of the COVID pandemic and the procurement of a vaccine would have been an easy target, as well as its response to Putin's war in Ukraine and the refugee crisis. A referendum would have come eventually like a pressure relief valve blowing off, and under those circumstances, the result, whenever it came, could easily have been far more decisive and much harder to reverse. Of course, the pro-EU side would have preferred to win in 2016, but a reverse of the actual result, a slender victory for Remain, would no more have settled the European question than having no referendum in the first place. Just imagine the banner headlines on June 2014 and in 2016 in the Daily Mail. Cameron cheats his way to victory, Remain scrapes narrow win in all of this. And the right-wing anti-EU press would have simply carried on, accusing Cameron and Osborne of scaring voters into accepting the status quo. And don't forget Farage's now famous words that a 52-48 win for Remain would have been unfinished business. Well, never underestimate a fanatic. You need only look at Holyrood and how the SNP reacted to losing the 2014 Scottish independence referendum to see parallels, or indeed how the European movement got an adrenaline shot after the actual 2016 result when hundreds of new and still vibrant pro-European groups sprang up. It is the losers seeing the long-coveted prize snatched away who are spurred on, while the winners allow themselves to slip back into the old complacency. It's easy to see the logic behind the need for a supermajority. Only an overwhelming win settles great constitutional issues there. A narrow victory for Remain would have achieved the same result as no referendum, as I said. Britain would have limped along with the same half-hearted, semi-detached foot dragging that they have seen for the last 50 years. And eventually there would be another referendum and another until Brexit as a theory could finally be tested. And at some point the UK had to choose in or out and fully commit themselves or being one thing or the other. And contrary to the assertions afterwards, those who voted to leave in 2016 could not have understood what they were voting for because it was all subject to negotiation. And now, courtesy of Brexit, they do, and the vast majority, whichever side they were on, don't like what they see. The much delayed checks on EU imports begin at the end of January, adding time and cost to goods shipped in from the EU, especially foodstuffs. And later on October 6th, biometric checks on UK travellers entering the EU will begin, increasing journey times and contributing to the widespread feeling of discontent. Clarity is coming at enormous cost as the British public is given an expensive education in the intricacies of international travel and trade here. And there are pros and cons of being out of the European Union, just as there were pros and cons of membership. But as becomes clearer by the week, the list of Brexit cons is growing rapidly, while the pros column remains stubbornly short. Daniel Hannan, Shanker Singham and other leading lights of Brexit have said repeatedly, there is no point in Brexit unless Britain seizes the opportunity to diverge from the EU. And yet successive Conservative governments have delayed or even scrapped any significant divergence, fearing the political and economic damage that such a move would wreak. And if anything, they are closer now than they were at the end of 2020. The idea of developing UK CA standards has been abandoned in favor of keeping the EU CE mark, and there has been no significant ditching of retained EU law after 4 long years. And they have rejoined Horizon. Trade bodies and industries from food to steel and chemicals to automotive are warning that this government that they need alignment with European standards. And Labour will almost certainly sign a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, further locking them into the EU's regulatory orbit here. But be under no illusions, even with Richard Tice and Farage at the helm, the same unpalatable choices would need it to be faced, and they too would shrink from making them. You can't buck the markets, as Margaret Thatcher once said, and if they can't afford divergence because it makes no commercial or economic sense, that must lead to the conclusion that there's no point in Brexit. And this will come alongside the unstoppable demographic changes, as I guess it was Paul Wilner who pointed that out in the Yorkshire bylines in October. Over the next few years, there will never be a better time since the early 1970s to make the case for EU membership. Politicians need to tell a positive story to a receptive audience who understand more clearly what being in the EU means, against a Eurosceptic opposition in retreat, against the rising tide of observed reality, from the mountains of red tape and trade barriers to the petty inconveniences of European travel. And Starmer, like Cameron in reverse, will be unable to hold the current line on Europe with a party which is overwhelmingly pro-EU. And he probably is himself. But pressure for a second decisive referendum will grow over time. Brexit has been nothing less than a huge commercial, diplomatic and social experiment. And looking back, it was a premise that had to be tested, not only to convince voters flirting with Euroscepticism in the UK, but as a warning to others across the rest of Europe. No one is thinking about that anymore. And so I think it's quite obvious Britain will one day try to return to the EU. Poorer, weaker, chastened and contrite to be sure. And it will not be quick or easy. The road to contrition is going to be long and hard. But it will be seen as an essential journey of self-discovery that wouldn't have been necessary without Brexit, but couldn't have been made without it either. In the years to come, only a small number of die-hard fanatics will still be clinging to the idea that quitting the EU has improved anything. In the long run, they will look back on Brexit as a necessary purgatory before Britain finally becomes a fully committed pro-European, and from that aspect, it will be not seen as a failure, but as a success. But that point is far out in the distant future, and even there is a lot of healing needed to make anyone in the EU able to ever even be willing to think about a return of the UK to the EU. So this is a distant future stuff. But in the end, Brexit already had some benefits, but not those that the Brexiteers wanted. Nobody in the EU is talking about leaving the EU anymore, except some very small group of die-hard idiots, but not as countries' politics. And so that was a big help for the EU here. And if you want to know more about Brexit or UK politics, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.